for your attention. So the question we've been asked to discuss is whether nationalism is a virtue or a vice. And in order to begin the question, topic that could debate in itself, whether Ramesh and I understand the term in the same way. What I want to propose is that nationalism is hopefully defined not as an ideology or political theory, but rather as a style of politics informed by three basic assumptions. First, that the world is divided into peoples. Second, that those peoples are defined by objective characteristics, such as language or religion or common descent. And third, that the people should be the focus of political loyalty, allegiance, or sovereignty. And that's really the key assumption. Now, all of these assumptions have a long history and in some ways extend back to the great sources of Western civilization, the Hebrew and the Greek philosophical tradition. Accepted only relatively recently, sometime between about 1700 and about 1900, so in the last 1 to 3 centuries. Now, why did that happen? Briefly, the Reformation played a role, and in particular, the rediscovery of the Hebrew Bible as a source of political guidance. So did the democratic theories of sovereignty, adopted and popularized by the French and American revolutions, and finally technological changes that encouraged communication and travel on a broader scale. First the printing press and later railroads. All of these contributed to one degree or another. But was this a good or a bad thing, the emergence of a mass politics based on these assumptions? I think the record is mixed. On the one hand, the emergence of nationalism helped destroy a pluralistic, aristocratic civilization of extraordinary beauty and accomplishment. And I should think that that destruction would be a matter of particular interest to Catholics. On the other hand, nationalism promoted the establishment of constitutional governments that provided a much greater degree of personal freedom and dignity to many more people that had enjoyed those goods in the past. And it's nationalism in this sense, or in this connection, that it's praised by great liberal theorists like John Stuart Mill. But later in the 19th century, nationalism came into tension with some of these accomplishments. Increasingly, the people, often narrowly defined, was pitted against constitutional institutions and guarantees of individual rights that were thought to constrain it from achieving its destiny. And this is the semi-mystical populist strand of nationalism that critics often have in mind when they denounce it. Now, I am among those critics. I have very little difficulty pronouncing this brand of nationalism vicious. Not all expressions of populist nationalism were equally bad, but they did have tendencies toward violence, toward repression of dissent and pluralism, and also, and this may seem a petty point, but I think is not insignificant, to utter vulgarity, extraordinary vulgarity in the arts and culture. But you're not here entirely for a history lesson, although if it turns out that you are, you can ask questions on these topics and I'm happy to elaborate. The real issue, of course, is to do with nationalism today, not as it might have been in the 19th or early 20th century. So which is it, a virtue or a vice? My fear, which stays with me on most days, although not all days, is that the present revival of nationalism stands in this populist and illiberal tradition. It tends to be exclusive, crude, and often cruel, sometimes intentionally so. At a certain degree of abstraction, it's not difficult to describe a nationalism that would avoid these vices. But in practice, nationalism for us today seems to pit so-called real Americans, or implicitly white, native-born, Christian, and provincial, against what must be therefore described as fake America, which is everybody else. And I do confess a personal interest here, because I belong to fake America, and I resent the implication that I and many others who share and characteristics don't belong to this country. Now, not to say there aren't legitimate grievances behind the present revival of nationalism, and include the indifference of major political institutions, an economic decline of the social and cultural. Address these grievances. I think that it's important that we who in the country ensure that the war is not worse than the disease. And that's the fear that I can regarding at least the present nationalist revival.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes, thank you very much. I guess it's my job to defend cruelty, vulgarity. Our hosts, human ecology is one of my favorite kinds of ecology, and I always enjoy being here. Thank you all for coming. It's actually a treat, particularly this week, to be invited to lift my gaze up from day-to-day politics a little bit, and I'm particularly impressed that Professor Goldman was able to make all those remarks about nationalism without ever, I believe, uttering the syllable Trump. I can't promise that I'm going to follow that example. I don't know whether we're going to have a sort of titanic clash here, because I reject some of the same things that Professor Goldman rejects. That different people mean different things by nationalism. I think that's very true, and one of the reasons we tend to have unproductive discussions of it is precisely because of the plasticity of the term. So people who agree on all the underlying beliefs might disagree or think they disagree because they're using the term in different ways. So George Orwell's famous Notes on Nationalism, I think, has had a really unhelpful effect on the conversation about nationalism, because Orwell nationalism in a actually sort of idiosyncratic way. He defines it really as a kind of power worship, a kind of way, because universal ideology that's going to govern everybody in the world, and not, at least in theory, make decisions based on race and ethnicity, and wants to overthrow every government in the world at the time that, but one, at the time that he was writing. That too is a kind of nationalism. I think that if you read that essay and just sort of think of it as a study in the evils to which certain kinds of ideology and power worship lend themselves, you can gain a lot from it, but it's not actually particularly helpful when you're thinking in terms of what most people mean by the word nationalism. So I want to say a little bit, of course, about what kind of nationalism I think is worth defending, what kind I think isn't worth defending, and why I think it's important things, that is, to